It's Sunday afternoon, and it's been a while. Let me adjust this volume just a little bit. Just a little bit. There. It's been a while since those who laugh at me have had a chance to indulge their mirth. My partner and I were heading home yesterday from a curbside pickup at one of our area grocery stores. And on the way up Liberty Street is the West Side's main north-south artery. It bridges 12th, which is Route 5, with 26th, which is Route 20, for those of you who don't live in this area. And I live 2 blocks east of Liberty at 22nd. This is the neighborhood that was always referred to as Little Italy because between 17th and 26th, west of Sassafras and east of probably Cascade or Raspberry, that was the neighborhood created by the Italians for the Italians, who pretty much ruled the West Side in Erie's earliest days. Not the earliest. The city was settled by Germans, Jewish Germans, and Irish fishermen. But the West Side was populated by Italian immigrants. So anyway, I bought my house back in '89, formerly owned by the Kilmers, and prior to that, the Saraceno family. Original owners, Pfeffers, now in St. Pete Beach, Florida, if they're still alive. Why am I going into this detail? Because this kind of orients me in this neighborhood. And I was thinking yesterday, from the time I graduated from college to the present, I have lived among the poorest people. My first teaching job was in the district, which is one of Erie's poorest sectors. It used to have the highest academic average back when I was in high school, but demographics having changed remarkably, those neighborhoods near East High School back in the mid-'80s were already populated by poor whites and poor blacks. My students were the poorest, their parents were among the poorest. And moving from that school to the West Side for 6 months, sort of temporarily by the district, I still had largely underprivileged children in my music classes because the lower West Side by that time was also populated largely by poor people. Erie's biggest employer, General Electric, had endured during the 80s some major layoffs, some major shutdowns, but in recent years, once they sold off their locomotive building and the aerospace, GE left Erie, the paper company left Erie. Once those 2 major employers were turned over, poverty became pretty entrenched in the Lower East and Lower West Side. I taught in those districts for the first 5 years of my 25 years in total, and for the remaining 20 in various elementary schools across Erie, the final 12 being in a neighborhood which was not populated by impoverished families, but unfortunately it would emerge several broken homes and a lot of drug trafficking. There were drug busts that happened a block away from that school. The home I purchased in '89 over here on 22nd, at that time, I was told the neighborhood was transitional. Most of the people who had lived here were older Italians. Once they passed away, their families did not occupy the property. The properties were sold, and they became rental properties. Most of the homes around me are rental properties. Some in disrepair, some in maintained repair, but still, the people who live in this neighborhood are impoverished. I live alone here. I've been alone in this home since '89, the sole owner and occupant. I've had a couple people stay here for a few weeks or months, but not here in residence. So for most of my adult life, from 1986 to the present, I have lived among the poor. And it's kind of ironic because my parents, although we lived comfortably, were never wealthy financially and would have qualified as poor across several decades of my first 25 years due to the recession in the 70s and the lack of higher education afforded my parents during their earlier years. And what I'm noticing during the COVID-19 pandemic is that there's a disconnect between those in power over decision making with regard to this pandemic and those who live in close proximity to one another due to poverty. I can recall several weeks ago our county executive who has taken it upon herself to be the spokesperson for the development and the spread, for dispensing the information to our county regarding this virus's expression. I remember her saying that fortunately we here in Erie County do not live in close proximity to one another. She doesn't. She lives in, I think, Fairview. Fairview has always been the suburb of the highest income per capita. Mill Creek is the surrounding county around the city of Erie, Fairview being, I think it's a borough adjacent to Mill Creek. Mill Creek is pretty spread out in terms of square mileage. It surrounds the city, largely south and west. It's called Zone 5 on the Pennsylvania map of COVID zones. The city of Erie is Zone 1. Excuse me, I correct myself. It's called Zone 2. Mill Creek is Zone 2. The city is Zone 1. And then the counties south and east and west of us are much larger. The boroughs and the townships expand because the rural property begins almost immediately as soon as one crosses the city of Erie's and Mill Creek's line. But in a city, houses are, some of them, 6 to 9 feet apart because there are no driveways separating them. And this goes on for blocks and blocks and blocks and blocks and blocks of dwellings in the city of Erie, populated currently, I think, by about 90,000. So when we consider the number of deaths from the COVID virus in New York City and the population density, I'm sure there's a direct correlation. Although in New York, even the wealthy live in close proximity because of the multiple apartment buildings and so forth. But in cities like Erie, flats and bungalows with no driveways between them are very compressed. And so the people, we were noticing coming up Liberty the other day, or no, it wasn't Liberty. Where was it? Coming up. And I remember remarking that between several houses, oh, I know where they are. They're over on Myrtle, which is just the block east of the Erie Cemetery. Those homes on Chestnut and Cherry are the two north-south routes that border the Erie Cemetery. And I live a block further west. Those homes, if you were reaching out with your arm from one window, you could touch the hand of the person reaching out their arm from their window between the two homes. And that's just a couple blocks from where I live. My father was a barber. My mother was an in-house seamstress and dressmaker working out of our home. My father owned his own barbershop on a tiny corner on the Lower East Side. You know, so as we think about the United States and the populace and how we're all reacting to the stay-at-home order and this gradual reopening, it's easy to see why some would argue their right to their freedoms, simply because they have them. They have acreage. They can go outside and enjoy the air and walk 3 miles and not even leave their own property, or hardly. And that is not true amongst the poor. So the perspectives are informed by experience. It's important, therefore, to remember this as we express our opinions socially, as we establish our position on social media, and as we attempt to defend our position. Sometimes we speak from a very, very narrow perspective, even if we live in a grand expanse. I think those with a broader perspective tend to live in the narrowest of margins. And it's that perspective that should control decisions made which benefit the greater good. As we celebrate the freedom we all deserve, let's remember how much freedom some Americans enjoy and how much freedom others have never known. And through no fault of their own. When we talk about blessings, let's remember that we are in the position to provide blessing to those less fortunate than ourselves. Jesus said, and God said, love thy neighbor as thyself. The least among us should come first.